All right, welcome back. Let me make sure we've got audio here. Welcome back. We're on 19, Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, Augustine and Aquinas. So if you haven't done these before, we do these watch parties and discussions every Monday at 9 a.m. PST, 5 p.m. GMT. Each lecture is about an hour long. Then we do a discussion shortly after. We'll take a 10-minute break in between. Then you guys can jump into the Zoom call, and that will be at futurethinkers.org/discuss. As always, UV is going to be taking notes as we go through this, and you can check that out at futurethinkers.org/meaning crisis notes. It actually really helps me to understand what John is going through, covering, because I'm more of like a reader, I guess, than a watcher. Anyway, the discussion Zoom link, as I mentioned, will be given in the intermission again. So we'll see you there, and let's get started.
Welcome back to Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. Last time we were talking about this interaction and confluence between nascent Christianity, the transformation that's undergoing the Platonic tradition in Neoplatonism and Gnosticism. We had ended up by talking about Plotinus and how he brings about this grand unification of the best science of the time, Aristotle, the best therapy of the time, Stoicism, and the best spirituality of the time, Platonism, and this is done all in a way that powerfully integrates mystical experience, achieving higher states of consciousness, and rational argumentation. Things that we now experience as diametrically opposed: science and spirituality, reason and transformation, therapy and realness. All of these things were not, they were instead powerfully mutually supportive. Now, Plotinus is around 270 or so of the Common Era, and after him, of course, the Roman Empire starts to go into decline, and we're seeing the end of the ancient world. And there is a figure there, a towering figure, who basically brings this configuration, this triangle that I've mentioned, of Christianity, Neoplatonism, and Gnosticism together. He's deeply influenced by all of them, although he will eventually give priority to Christianity. And that's Augustine. So Augustine is a Roman, and he's alive in the 4th century into the beginnings of the 5th century as the Roman Empire is entering its final stages. So as you can imagine, that impending collapse is bringing with it a very dark vision of the world. And for that reason, Augustine is attracted to Manichaeism. Now, this is a religion that was started by Mani from Persia, and many people argue that it is a Gnostic religion. Some people disagree with applying the term Gnostics to it. Again, it doesn't matter. It seems to have picked up on a lot of the same kinds of ideas about a machinery in which we're enmeshed as creatures of light, and that light has to be liberated by a special kind of gnosis. And Augustine is deeply attracted to this religion. He's attracted to this religion precisely because it is, as I said, it has Gnostic components in it, and therefore promises to address his own personal loss of agency, which I'll talk about momentarily, but also to address what is becoming more and more salient to people of Augustine's time, which is a world that is darkening around them. So he's influenced by that, which means ideas of evil and evil powers and structures in the world are very salient to Augustine. He also deeply suffers, as I mentioned, personally. He is riven with inner conflict. To put it, I think, in terms that would make sense to us today, Augustine is a sex addict. He is deeply addicted to sexual behavior. He described it this way, and I think this is a particularly apt way of describing his addiction. He said, "I was always licking the open sore of lust," which gives you a very telling image of a compelling desire and something disgusting and degrading, and it's also exacerbating and making worse the very affliction that you're suffering. So he suffers tremendous self-loathing because of this, tremendous loss of agency. And he struggles to try and find a way of getting free from his own personal inner conflict and degradation, and also providing an answer to the evil that he sees in the world. He writes the first autobiography in the history of the West, the Confessions, and in there he relates an experience which deeply, deeply affected him. I would say it came close to traumatizing him. So when he was young, he relates this story. He and some of his friends broke into a courtyard and stole some fruit. And you're thinking, most of us would think, yeah, a young adolescent performing, a misdemeanor act of minor theft, stealing some fruit, who cares? But this is Augustine. He's already enmeshed in a Manichaean worldview. He's already deeply he's becoming aware as an adolescent of how powerful his drives can be. And what affected Augustine about this very profoundly is, he said he did not want the fruit. He did not desire the fruit. He wasn't really trying to impress his friends. He wasn't desiring that. He came away with a very strong experience. It's almost like a reverse of a higher state of consciousness. He came away with a very strong experience that he stole the fruit simply because it was the wrong thing to do. That he wanted to do this. There was something in him that was dragging him down. And this is, again, why this worldview appealed to him. There's these, it's like, again, Manichaeanism is very much like the Star Wars mythology of the light and the dark side. There's a dark side, and it's drawing people down, and it's the side of desire and anger and destruction, right? And Augustine sees this alive within his own body in his sexual addiction. So he travels around the world, he teaches rhetoric, and he becomes eventually connected and familiar with philosophy. And something happens to him that's quite profound. He reads the work of Plotinus. He reads the work of Plotinus. He has a very high opinion of Plotinus. He later writes, in Plotinus, Plato lived again. And he writes very glowingly of the Platonists. And in Plato, and especially in Plotinus, Augustine sees a different way. He gets a worldview other than the Manichaean worldview. He gets the Neoplatonic worldview, and he gets it. I mean this in the Gnosis sense. He gets it. Augustine has a mystical experience while reading Plotinus. He has that ascent up to the one. He rises through the levels of reality and levels of his self, and he has this mystical experience, but he can't hold it. He can't stay there. The darkness in him has so much gravity, pulls him back down and pulls him back towards that world of lust and addiction, that reciprocal narrowing, that Mark Lewis talks about so powerfully. And he wonders, why is the gravity pulling me? Why is the darkness that pulls me down? Why is it so powerful? Is there anything that can overpower it and pull me up? He says, I get what Plotinus is talking about, but the evil within me, it's too strong. The darkness pulls me down too much. He'll later come to say that this is like a hole in being, and it's just sucking the light away. And so he has what some people have reported having after they have some mystical experiences. He has a rebound effect of despair. It's like if I was to show you a beautiful place, this beautiful beach, and when you stepped onto the beach, you finally felt at peace, like the peace you've sought all your life, and there's beauty around you, and you feel alive and vital, but you can't stay. You can't, somehow you just can't hold, and you're drawn away, and you can't stay there. Now the place you're in, the darkness and the squalor that you're in, is so much worse because you have been in the light and you know you were incapable of staying there. So he's falling into despair, and he's at his mother's house, and his mother is a Christian, Monica. And he's in the backyard, like the courtyard, and he's listening, and he hears a child's voice say, take up and read. And there's a Bible there, or an early version of a Bible, and he picks it up just where it is, and he happens to, of course, read the work of Paul. And in Paul, he finds an affinity, a deep affinity, that kindred spirit. Because in Paul, he sees that same inner conflict, that same tortured inner conflict, and he sees a worldview that makes sense of that inner conflict. And Augustine has this insight. He says, look. Pay attention to Plotinus. Pay attention to Plato. What are they saying? Plato and Plotinus are ultimately saying we're driven by two powerful loves. We're driven by the love of becoming one within and becoming one with what is most real. Just what's driving all of our reason is love. A love for what's true, a love for what's good, a love for what is beautiful. And then he says, at the heart of reason is love. And what's damaged in me is my capacity to love. Not my capacity to reason. That's why I have this sexual addiction. My capacity for love has been thwarted and twisted by my sexuality. So I need something that can heal. Remember the gnosis, the healing. I need to be healed. There's a love that is within reason that can help you grow beyond reason to what reason always sought. How do we grow in love? Well, agape. That's what the Christian message is. Agape, by participating in agape, we grow in love. We grow in the love that is driving us to becoming persons, fully realized persons. So Augustine says, Neoplatonism needs Christianity. And the healing and the response to evil that Gnosticism was looking for can actually be found in Christianity. And so he synthesizes them all together. So Notice what we now have. Let's put this together very carefully in Augustine. And notice the way he's putting it. He's not putting it out there as a theory. He's writing an autobiography. He's talking about it in a perspectival and participatory way. He writes the first autobiography, the Confessions. This is not a dry academic treatise. This is an existential manual how you can also go through the process that he has gone through. It is gnosis through and through. Okay, so from Plotinus, what do we have? Well, Plotinus already has given us, because part of Plotinus is the Aristotelian worldview. That's the nomological order we talked about, right? The conformity theory, right? The geocentric worldview, the two things in attunement. This is the best science account of the structure of reality and how reality is known. From Plotinus himself, we get now what I'm going to call the normative order. Plotinus gave us an account of how we can move in a coordinated fashion up the levels of reality, up the levels of consciousness, up the levels of the self, from what is less real to what is more real. What's Augustine going to do with that? Well, look, what's less real? What's down here has less oneness, less integration. It makes less sense. Look, when I destroy something, what do? I take away its structural functional organization. I make it more disordered. Right? As I go downward, things are fragmenting, having less and less form, less and less eidos. They're less and less intelligible. They're less and less understandable. This becomes more and more pure chaos. I'm losing truth. I'm losing goodness. I'm losing beauty. I'm losing what makes things to be and what makes them to be sensible and intelligible. This is evil. Down here is that's the hole. That's the tear in being towards which things can fall. But I can also move up to what's more true, more good, more real. And of course, what Plotinus knows is that this is driven by a love of knowing what is real and simultaneously becoming what is more real. And so for Augustine, this of course, and Plato even called it, if you remember, the good. This is the normative order. The nomological order tells you how things are structured. The normative order tells you how you can become better, how you can deal with evil, and how you can increase realness, meaning in your life. Augustine takes that, and as I've shown you, he says, wait, the thing about Aristotle is, well, you know what? Everything was moving to get where it belongs. Right? But that's all it is in Aristotle. But I think, Augustine is basically saying, that everything is moving in a way in order to try and move us away from evil towards goodness. And so he says, I think Christianity puts these two together. The world, everything is moving on purpose, and the purpose is to try and afford realization, both cognitive and in the world. Things are becoming more real, we're becoming more real, we're realizing that. And then he says, and you know what? All of this is driven by love and about the transformation that happens in me, the gnosis agape. That's the narrative order of Christianity. There's this great narrative. There's this great story about the course of history. And the course of history is a course, right, of moving, right, towards a final consummation, the promised land. And that is the history of God's love, of God's agape, of God intervening and creating the open future. But that agape isn't just a historical force, it's also a normative force in me. It's also leading me upward towards the good. What Augustine does is he says, Christianity can put all of these things together. The world is organized this way so that it moves through history this way so that all of us can self-transcend this way. All three orders come together in a mutually supporting fashion. Now, we know from current cognitive science, right, that the three components of meaning that people talk about, the things that contribute to meaning in life, and this is Henselman's work and others, are a sense of coherence. I'll explain what this means in a minute. A sense of significance, and a sense of purpose. I got to talk to Samantha Henselman about this. The more coherent, the more intelligible, the more things fit together for you, the more real they are, the more meaningful you find your life. Well, that's the nomological order. How things fit together and make sense in a coherent fashion. What about significance? Significance is this: how valuable, how deep in reality, how good are the elements of your life. That's the normative order. Purpose. Does your life have a direction? Is it moving in a course? That's the narrative order. Human beings want things to make sense. They need a nomological order. And Augustine says, I have this. It's the Aristotelian world order, and I can give a Christian explanation of that. They want things to be significant. They want to satisfy the anagogic drives of inner peace and contact with reality. And Augustine says, I can tell you that because I can tell you how to put reason and agape together. That's what Christianity does. And people want things to have a purpose. They want there to be, right, a story. Christianity is offering the ultimate story. Augustine puts it all together. And he puts it all together as the Roman Empire is literally collapsing. He's in Hippo in North Africa when the barbarians are literally at the gate laying siege to the city. And he's basically laying the foundations for what's going to come next. He's laying foundations for the medieval worldview. But what do we have from this? What we have, right, and we'll come back to the cognitive science, what we have is a very long and powerful history that tells us how our culture has articulated the axial revolution, how it has given a grammar, a way of understanding what the axial revolution has given us. It has given us a system for interpreting and inhabiting a worldview in which meaning and wisdom, as understood by the axial revolution, have been developed and have been articulated in a sophisticated and compelling fashion. Meaning is to have a nomological order that connects us to what is real. It is to have a normative order that connects us, not intellectually, but existentially, to what is good so that we can become better. Meaning is to have a narrative order that tells us how we can move forward through history, both collective and individual history. But what I've tried to show you is that these are not three separate things. They're like the three dimensions, right, of a space, the space of meaning. They're the three axes of the space of meaning. This is a beautiful synthesis. It's the culmination of tremendous amount of historical development. It's profound. And it's not just an intellectual thing. It is, as I've tried to show you, it is simultaneously a scientific thing, a spiritual thing, a therapeutic thing, an existential thing. This is why this is going to last 1,000 years. Because it is such a powerful and enriching vision. Imagine if you could, what if I could offer this to you and make it deeply historically, scientifically, and intellectually viable for you? What if I could offer to you a worldview that had the deepest scientific legitimacy, totally integrated with the most profound spirituality, no antagonism, no irrationality in it, conjoined seamlessly with a personal project of therapy, of therapeutic change and healing, and sapiential education, the cultivation of genuine wisdom and self-transcendence, in community with yourself, your world, your culture, and other people. Would you not want this? So here's the question you now have to ask yourself. Why don't you have it? Because we know from the science that's what you want. We know from the history that that's what our culture has, like our foundational culture from the Axial Revolution built for us. Why don't we have it? Is it irredeemably lost? When we lost the Gnostic mythology, when we lost the Axial mythology, the two worlds mythology, when we lost the mythology of Christianity, are we now bereft forever? So, part of the way I can start to answer that, the short answer for a long series of arguments that are forthcoming is no. I think there is a response. That's why this series is entitled Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, not despairing because of the meaning crisis. But we're only halfway through, right? We're only halfway through posing the problem. We need to understand, we're getting an understanding of this meaning and this wisdom. We're getting how it was articulated and developed and woven into our cultural framework, our cognitive machinery, the very grammar of our existential modes. But we still don't know, why does it all fall apart? How does it all come apart? And where does that leave us? We need a better understanding of the genealogy now of the crisis. Now that we have a better historical understanding of the nature of the meaning that was lost, we need to understand the process of loss. So, as I said, this world is the world that Augustine bestows, and this is what you need to understand. There's tremendous loss when the Roman Empire collapses. It's not as great as the Bronze Age collapse, but it's major. But it's only in the West, by the way, not in the East. The Byzantine Empire survives. But nevertheless, there's a traumatic loss of cities, literacy, trade, commerce. The standard of living that was lost in the Roman Empire is not recovered again until 1750 in London, England. Takes that long for that standard of living to be recovered again. So this is very traumatic. But the heritage given by Augustine is so powerful that it serves as, and I'm using this word very carefully now, I hope you understand, it serves as a home for people throughout all of this turbulent turmoil. But some things start to happen that start to pull it apart. This sacred canopy starts to be torn apart and can no longer shelter us from our terrors and our despair. So one of the first things is, in 1054, there's a division. And I'm not going to go into all, part of it has to do with that the Roman Empire in the West collapses, but it doesn't collapse in the East. The East is Greek-speaking, the West is Latin-speaking. That in addition to Augustine, the East is deeply influenced by Dionysius, pseudo-Dionysius, also the case in the West. But there's a lot of cultural, historical, socioeconomic differences in how Christianity was understood, and they split apart. There's what's called the Great Schism. So Christianity splits between an Eastern Orthodox and what's going to be called a Catholic version of Christianity. This, of course, weakens Christianity. It also has an impact on it. By separating itself from the East, Christianity loses some of the connection, at least the Christianity in the West, Western Europe. Christianity loses some of its deeper connections to that Neoplatonic mystical theology. And that starts to have an impact. The West starts to become less and less Platonic and more Aristotelian. Now, as always, this starts, right? This starts with a change in psychotechnology. So, Ivan Illich has done some work looking at the work of Hugh of St. Victor, who was around from 1096 to 1141. And what he points out, and Chetham talks about this in his book, in his books, and Chetham also refers, as Corbin does too. Corbin talks about this. Chetham talks about this, refers to the work of Krantz and others. Trying to summarize a lot of this, what's happening is there's a shift in reading, how people read, right? And it's after the schism. So before that, and this is something I can speak to from first person, before that, reading is done largely aloud. People read aloud. They read the Bible, for example, because that's mostly the only thing that can be read. And some of the church fathers, people like Augustine, for example, they read aloud. Reading is often done communally. So first of all, you're embedded in a cultural context. You're embedded in a sapiential community. You read aloud, and more than you read aloud, you're reciting. So let's try and get something in your experience that might bring this out, okay? Think of the difference between reading a poem and reciting a poem. And it's no coincidence, by the way, that when Gabriel spoke to Muhammad, he told him to recite, not to write. Okay? What happens when you... something wonderful. Last Saturday was my birthday, and so it was a surprise party. My partner, she organized a wonderful party for me. And I'd always said that instead of gifts, I would prefer it if people brought one of their favorite pieces of poetry and read it aloud. So it was a poetry party. And people read it aloud. And There's such a difference between reading a poem silently and reading it aloud, because the intonation and the sharing it with others makes it very different. What was particularly beautiful is my girlfriend, actually, she's a gifted singer. She actually sang her version of the poem by Robert Frost. It's the famous one about the two roads diverge, and I took the road less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. But when somebody is singing a song, singing a poem, and most songs are poems if you think about it, right? It is appealing to you not just propositionally. It's not just, right, that kind of knowing. It's not just trying to create beliefs in you. First of all, by reciting the poem, right, you and trying to communicate it to others, you have to bring in all your know-how of communication. Being able to share with other people. You have to, all your ways of paying attention, much more embodied. There's the perspectival stuff. What does it feel like? What is it like to be here in this space, in this context, with these people, uttering these words? And with that, it has the potential to be participatory, because people are like, these are poems that have changed them, have made a difference to their identity. They know these poems not the way you know the words on the back of your cereal box. They know these poems because of the way in which they have been changed by them. Their very sense of identity has been altered by it. See, so when people were reading then, they're reading the Bible, they're reciting it communally. They're also doing something, and I do this practice now, and other people do, right? It's called Lectio Divina. It's a way of reading a text, right, in which you are not the point is not to have the propositions and to speak. It is to let the text as much as possible speak to you. It is to engage with the text in a meditative, mindful fashion, opening yourselves up to the possibility of it transforming you. It is much more like going to listen to a piece of music and having prepared yourself, prepared the receptivity to have a profound aesthetic experience. It's analogous to that. You're reading and you're reciting in such a way that you're trying to open yourself up to this text speaking to you. People that are religious will often talk about this as if God is present in the text and speaking to them through the text. This is how people were reading. It's a form of reading that is ontologically remedial. It's designed to heal you, transform you. It's designed to trigger, activate, and educate your procedural, perspectival, and participatory knowing. Not just give you propositions. It's about helping you in your reading remember the being mode and not just have beliefs and propositions. But people start to read differently shortly thereafter. What's happening is people are shifting from, right? So, Avicenna, which is an anglicized form of Ibn Sina, who's a great Persian philosopher. He was, up until this time, the dominant interpreter of that Augustinian worldview, that whole Augustinian way. And he gives priority to the Neoplatonic. And Corbin is going to make a lot of the fact that Persian philosophy was always trying to keep the Neoplatonic and Gnostic elements of spirituality alive. Persia has played a much greater role in world history and cultural history than we have properly given credit to in the so-called West. But he gets replaced by Averroes, right? And Averroes is more purely Aristotelian. And what that really means is a shift a shift to giving exclusive priority to definitions. Remember, Aristotle tried to understand essences, the eidos as essences and essences as definitions. And that's very problematic because many things don't have definitions. But definitions and propositions. So people now start to read silently to themselves, and what they give priority to, right, is coherence within a language rather than transformation within themselves and the world. So what matters is how the various symbols, and I don't mean that in a spiritual sense, the various propositional terms and logical connectives fit together coherently. So a new model for thought emerges. See, the old model was thought is a conforming to the world, and then we got this articulated and developed and expanded into this whole process of gnosis and anagoge and self-transformation. That model of knowing, that's also a way of being, that's also a way of becoming, that's being taken away, and it's being replaced by a different model. Thought, knowing, is to have coherent propositional language. Thinking is to have a coherent set of propositions in your head. So Kranz talks about we shift from the extensive self, the self that is transjectively connected to the world, that understands itself in terms of its conformity to the world, to, right, an intensive self. This is a self that's inside my head. It's inside my beliefs. Myself is primarily the way I talk to myself by affirming my beliefs through propositional language. So people start to think that the primary way in which we know things is to get as much coherence within our inner language than instead of conformity in our outer existential modes. Now, why would people make this shift? People make this shift because the world is starting to open up again. People are starting to get interested in knowing the world scientifically. We're getting, it's just slowly beginning here, right? But we're going to get the move towards the value of having, and by the way, I believe in this value. I'm a scientist, right? The value of logically coherent, well-organized propositional theories. The power of this is being discovered. So when I can read in this other way, right, I can empower my argumentative skills tremendously. What I'm losing, right, what I'm losing is I'm losing reading as a psychotechnology of psycho-spiritual existential transformation. Reading is now becoming the consumption of propositions and their structuring in logical coherency. Why? Well, as I said, there's the beginning of this reorientation towards the external world, and it's being driven by the fact that Aristotle is coming into prominence because he's being rediscovered. So because of the Crusades, there is a rediscovery of the works of Aristotle that had largely been lost to Western Europe. And in Aristotle, there is a problem for Christianity. There's a problem for Christianity. The problem is we have a figure that can't be ignored. Aristotle is part of that whole ancient world that Augustine gave us. He's the author of the nomological order that Augustine has baptized with Christianity's approval. So Aristotle can't be ignored, but Aristotle describes a world that does not have a lot of the Christian mythology attached to it, and offers explanations for things that Christianity makes no effort to explain. So there is this tremendous attraction to the power, the new explanatory power provided by Aristotle. And the model he gives of getting clear definitions and clear syllogistic inferences and building up a very clear picture is enmeshed with this new way of reading and this new way of experiencing knowing and experiencing oneself primarily inside one's head, inside one's language. So Aristotle can't be ignored or rejected because of his eminent authority, but neither can he simply be assimilated into the Christian worldview, because he talks about and explains things and does things in a manner that you don't find in the Bible. So more and more people are reading in this new way. They're starting to emulate the new, Aristotelian science, but this is starting to cause a crisis within Christianity. And so there's an individual who arises who sees the looming threat that this poses, who sees two things happening. There's a change in the psychotechnology of reading, and there is a change in how people are starting to look at the world. Both of these changes are associated with the difficulty of assimilating the rediscovered Aristotle into a Christian worldview. But Thomas Aquinas takes up the task of solving this problem. He's going to be a pivotal figure precisely for that reason. Now, again, Thomas Aquinas, voluminous writing, and there's a whole group of people, both theologians and philosophers, Thomistic, and there's all kinds of controversy around, how Aristotelian Aquinas is, how Platonic he is, right? I'm going to again try and present the way I think he was historically taken up and basically understood. So, for Aquinas, how do we salvage both the Christian worldview and the new science of the rediscovered Aristotle? Well, he does something really brilliant. He goes to the fundamental grammar of all of this. What's the fundamental grammar of this? It's the mythology of the two worlds. The axial revolution is there's two worlds. There's the real world and the illusory world, right? And that has been a constant throughout all of this. And he comes up with a way of trying to assimilate it, right? So we have the two worlds, right? Here's in Plato, in the Platonic and even in the Augustinian, here's the everyday world, right? And then here is the real world. But what Aquinas does is he changes that. He says, this world is real too. There is real knowledge of this world possible. This is knowledge that we can get through reason and science. So reason and science study this world, and they can discover real truths about that through reason, through science. But this world up here is still somehow more real. How do we do that? Well, he invents a distinction that we tend to anachronistically push back on people before, and there are definitely precursors in Pseudo-Dionysius and Augustine, but the idea is this is the natural world that can be studied by reason and by science. This is the world above the natural world. What's the word for above? Super. So this is the supernatural world. And this is not a world that can be studied by science or reason. This is a world that is only, accessible by faith. So there's, now the two worlds have been made sort of fundamentally two separate kinds of worlds, and there isn't a continuum between them now. There isn't a way of moving through them by love and reason united together. What now happens is the following, and what's going to happen is the notion of faith is going to be changed too. Reason is down here, and love is up here. And the idea for Aquinas, I should say, is that love moves the will. See, in Plotinus, and even in Augustine, love moves reason. But for Aquinas, love moves the will. Love moves the will to assert things that it can't know through reason. So faith now becomes the act of willful assertion. Now, to be fair to Aquinas, this is not willful in the sense of my will. This is a will that is being driven by the love of God. But nevertheless, what's now happening is love and reason are being pulled apart. Faith is going from this participation in the flow, the course of history, to the assertion of propositions, the assertion of statements, giving a creed, and more fundamentally, science and spirituality are now being divorced from each other in a profound way, such that if it's scientific, it's not spiritual, and if it's spiritual, it's not scientific. And if you're talking, and you can see the beginnings of Romanticism, if it has to do with love, then it has nothing to do with reason, and if it has anything to do with reason, then it has nothing to do with love. And all of these things are now being pulled apart. Now Aquinas is a wonderful man, a wonderful writer. He is trying to save, the axial worldview by reformulating its fundamental grammar of two worlds into a formulation that is now becoming familiar to you. But here's the danger, and this is not a danger that Aquinas foresees. As this becomes more and more successful, and we less and less find our assertions, our will being driven by love, but just by willpower alone, this world becomes less and less real to us. The supernatural world. And if there is no supernatural world, if it's no longer, and listen to my language, if it's no longer viable to us, we can think about it and imagine it, but if it's no longer livable to us, then the whole axial world mythology, the whole axial world grammar, that grammar that gave us the grammar of meaning and wisdom and self-transcendence, that huge heritage is now threatened to fall apart. We'll start looking at that next time together. Thank you for your time and attention.
All right, guys, we're going to take a 10-minute break and then we're going to jump into the discussion. If you guys can hop into the watch party discussion Zoom call by going to futurethinkers.org/discuss. There'll just be a waiting room there, and then I'll let you guys all in after 10 minutes. So again, that's futurethinkers.org/discuss. Hello, hello. And I think we're live. How are you guys doing?
Hey, Mike, doing good. How are you?
Oh, I'm tired.
Yeah, I hear.
I need a vacation, dude.
Look at that little munchkin.
How is my audio today, Mike? How does it sound?
Pretty good.
Pretty good.
It's a little muted. I think that I'm using a different system today, just kind of trying to try something out. And the video quality's okay?
Yeah. Video is a little low in quality, I think, but not too bad.
Compared to normal?
Yeah, compared to the other one. Yeah.
Okay. I think I will switch back to my other system then because I think it's better.
Okay.
I'm going to do that.
I was enjoying the discussion. I kind of wasn't paying attention during the watch party and then went back and read through it. Good discussion.
It really is.
I
Yeah.
hope he, whoever that was, Kujin or something like that, joins.
Agreed.
I found myself having strong responses to his way of to his language choices.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt like there was a feeling about using the word weak that was kind of throwing the discussion in I don't know, maybe an uncomfortable place.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe what does that word mean to you that you feel it didn't apply?
Weak to me implies the phrase that pops into my head is like a lack of courage or a lack of trying, a lack of something. And I've spent enough time around addicts and alcoholics in my life to know that they are some of the most courageous, strong people I know. And so when I hear that word, it brings up a lot. And so this is giving me a lot to look at and sort of unpack.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I can tell that's an emotionally impactful thing. I think the way, I mean, I wasn't participating in that conversation, but I can see where he's coming from. And the way I see that word is very kind of almost clinical, not without a lot of judgments about the character of the person I would ever apply it to. It's just basically the external force is pushing against the internal projection or your internal force. And one of them is winning. And the whatever is necessary to overcome that external force is a degree of something. Maybe it's effort in some cases, maybe it's awareness in other cases, maybe it's courage, maybe it's a lot of the words that you've chosen, maybe it's none of them. But I would use it in almost like a physics kind of way. Like, is the force strong enough to overcome the external force? And that's why, and I wouldn't add any kind of emotional judgment to that. Like sometimes the external forces are astronomical. Yeah. Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
That is one of the things I'm aware of in myself is I have a difficult time with not hearing those words and putting a character like that. The only reason I have ever known people to use those words was out of a character judgment. And so having that separate thing, it's like, that's just basically my default that I go to is that it's, you would only be using those words as a character judgment. And so I appreciated that, what you shared with that.
And I'm only speaking for myself, but I can see myself using that word. I might be a little kind of more discerning in my choice to use that word than what was shown in the chat, but still, I may have still used it, and that would be my reasoning behind it. I wish he could come and explain that for himself, but yeah.
Well, and there was also something that he right towards the end of it being depression or addiction, or all of those things being a sign of not um juvenile, being a sign of juvenile ego, or I don't remember exactly how he worded it. And while on the one hand, yes, on the other hand, what are the reasons for that juvenile ego in terms of the trauma that was experienced that prevented someone from moving through the developmental stages that necessitated that? And so when I hear, and we're dealing with 200 characters, so there's not a lot of space, so I was trying to keep that in mind. But it's to make those assertions without also including reasons, or the reflection that there's reasons that people get stuck in those places. That's a very important part of the discussion for me, and something that I think, yeah, I just think that's an important part of the discussion of why does someone get stuck in a place of being in a juvenile ego, or being unable to move through certain things. So
What I'm seeing here is actually really awesome. The fact that, because I see this kind of meta conversational structure happening out there in the world quite a lot. These types of misunderstandings where certain words are triggering, and then we get lost in the emotion of that triggering word. Dude, come on. But I think the way you've responded to this, which is to push through, because it's clearly triggering and emotional, and you've just pushed through anyway to be discussing it, is like what I would love to see more of, because more often than not, it seems like people just shut down completely and go, you fucking, and get angry at the other. So, I mean, I'd like to commend you on that, to take that move to begin with. Okay.
Oh, poor little guy.
Yeah, I think that there's an important aspect of that I want to agree and say it is an interesting notion of the idea of, if I look at strength or weakness from a moral perspective, then there's a moral failing, which means I'm unworthy or not capable, and that's different from the physical ability, the physical strength. Does it just do I have the, and I made the comment in the thread that that Augustine didn't have that. He could feel the weakness of that. As much as he wanted to stay in that place, it pulled him back. And there's something in the moral development that does give that musculature, that ability to exercise the will. But I don't think it is a thing that says he is unworthy of it, or there's some other way to express that as well. There's something more subtle in the sense of what does that weakness represent? How does one actually learn to strengthen that thing, that aspect?
There's something about understanding that if the person making those claims is looking at it through an experiential lens, like I know I'm weak, and I know I'm insufficient in these ways, and it doesn't make me less of a person. I'm just muddling through and seeing myself and other people who are also muddling through, then the word, I think, probably has less sting to it, if you understand that they're coming at it from that way. It's when there's like this aspect of superiority to it. You're weak, which means I'm strong, I'm better. I think that's what pisses us off when we hear that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But
David, when you were talking, the thing that came up, and kind of tying in, Mike, what you were saying about the difference in the meta language, there's all of this conversation about the patriarchy, and I hate that term, and I hate bringing that. But David, your what you were saying about somebody hearing those words and taking that as a moral thing, and like what I hear is I've known a lot of men in my life who weakness is a bad thing. It is something to overcome. It is something to be avoided. And how destructive that mentality can be.
I think there's an important differentiation between weakness and vulnerability.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think most men look at it synonymously, those two words. It's vulnerability we need, but
Yeah.
weakness is something we work to fix in ourselves. And I don't see that word being the same. And therefore I feel okay to use that word as in a negative way, to say I'm weak in this area, I need to work on it. Or to take a father figure role as well, just have this guy all of a sudden, and now I have to think about that as a parent going forward, like how do I point out a weakness appropriately? Because usually it's like a lack of awareness, right? That would allow that weakness to keep going.
Yeah.
Hey, Mike, I'm in the waiting room on my iPad. If you can just check and see, let me in over there, that'd be cool. Cool. I'm gonna switch this over, make sure that's muted for the moment. Okay, that's muted. I'm gonna mute myself over here for a second.
Well, and I appreciated, just because of Augustine's,
Okay,
addiction,
there we go.
how that,
Yep.
brought this conversation up into the fore. And like, as you were saying that, that word, weakness, it's like it seems like there's a not different word, but well, like, is there a different word to describe that, of like, is some area where I want to work on building my strength, but being able to separate the moral judgment, that's how, and how difficult it is to separate those things.
It's related to another point that was brought up in the conversation, which is the you could say attachment to identity or personal ego. I think that that was a key thing here that we could maybe expand on. It's like I'm looking out at the world through my egoic lens, and when someone criticizes me, if I'm identified with the idea they're criticizing, it can feel like I'm being attacked. It can feel like what they're criticizing is a judgment on me, not a judgment on the thing. Like I have spinach on my face. I'm not like, that's a simple, funny example because it's very easy. It's very separate. You put it down and we know that that's an easy thing to separate from. We're not going to get offended. Some people still do, but we're not going to get offended by that. But there are things about our own personal character or our skill level or our work ethic or strength or roles that we do that are a lot more difficult to separate in the same way that we do take as personal attacks. So I think it's both a problem of language, because language kind of evolves over time, and in it how we perceive words as both as individuals and a collective changes. So it's like maybe the word weak, it meant in like a physical term, physics, is appropriate, but if we bring it into the context of human interaction, it's not appropriate because it has a different meaning. But on the other side of that, I think it's important that individuals do that personal work of separating themselves from their identities, from those different things, because that's the initial work that's required to then look at the thing like, I have an addiction, I am not the addiction, I have an addiction, then I can do something about it. But if I am the addiction, then it's out of my control. There's nothing I can do.
Yeah.
I feel like Yuvi probably would have a lot to say on this because we have this meta conversation almost daily.
I don't have anything to add so far.
There is an interesting thing about that, and notice the language, right? It's something that I noticed early on. There's an inversion having mode being mode dichotomy. It's an interesting polar opposite of what we normally mean, right? When I'm talking about my moral things, the having mode of being mode is different. This is interesting. Like in this mode, if I have spinach on my face rather than I am spinach on my face, right? If I am in the being mode, then that means something about who I am. I identify with my failings, with my weaknesses.
I'm the
Or
kind of a person who is such a slob that I would get spinach on my face versus I accidentally,
Right.
you know.
Right. There's a something of the ability to move from where I am to who I am, right?
One of the things that just came to mind is, Mike, I totally agree with what you're saying about that distinction, and same, David, what you're talking about the separate, the person doing the inner work to separate those things. But there is also the recognition that that we are community. You know, we are creatures that are part of a community, and there's often this thing of, well, you need to go do your inner work, whereas it's in the relationships, in feeling safe, that allows us to let go of that identity. And so it's this interesting balance. And so I think one of my strong things is when I hear certain language used in a conversation, it in my mind, I see it as someone like, okay, I don't care where anyone else in this conversation is in their emotional development. I'm going to use the language that I want to use, and you got to go deal with it. And how to understand that we have people in a lot of different stages of their development, and it's like, okay, yeah, I'm on this thing. I might take it. I might take it a little bit more personally, and it's something I'm trying to work through and own. And how do we as community help each other through that process, not just say, you got to go do your work.
I think that that's a really important thing as well, and I think it's one of the major themes that I see overall that comes up for me in watching the meaning crisis and watching the way that this flows through is a shift from orienting to the sense of self that comes from a reflection of what culture gives me, and the sense of self that arises from my own guidance and awareness,
Mhm.
right? Moving from external authority to internal authority, from this self-authored life that says, okay, I hear what my parents are telling me and what my teachers are telling me and what the books are telling me. And what I sense is this is what's right for me. And when I am grounded in that, then I can take the input without taking the injunction that I have to listen to the input. Whereas I'm born in a place I don't have that capacity. I actually have to develop the capacity to know how to listen to myself, to know what is signal versus noise, what is worth paying attention to. I watched, there's a video that Teal Swan, if anybody knows who she is, put out. She had a conversation, she had a presentation in Chicago in 2018, and it was talking about you have to actually see your hell. You actually have to witness your hell to get out of your hell.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an interesting thing, because she said, if what people end up doing is painting the walls of their hell with bright colors to convince themselves that it's not so bad, and that if you are truly in Auschwitz or some prison and your freedom is limited to that extent, that may be the best option that you have. You may not have anything other than convincing yourself that this is okay. But if you really have options, going for the simplest thing of just convincing myself this is okay, which is I say that, I recognize there's a judgmental thing there as well. Trying to go for the painting my cell that I'm in, the prison that I'm in, that hell that I'm in bright primary colors is not the best option, probably. That there are other options for actually exercising myself, but it actually takes taking down the wallpaper and seeing the cell that I'm in order to know how to get out of it. And it was an interesting. There's a lot of complexity there, a lot of nuance in there. And one of the things is that we truly are born into a situation where we are subject to the masters who care for us. We do not have sufficient agency to make our own choices for a significant period of time. And so we learn to pattern with coping mechanisms that I think lead towards reciprocal narrowing of dependence on the family unit, on the tribe, and on this propositional knowing of trying to make sense of it from that perspective, that has a hunger of getting more and more in that direction. It feeds the capacity to acquire the cultural propositional knowing that helps me orient to my culture. But then there's a point at which I think at certain points I can come back and look at it and say, okay, I've taken everything that is healthy for me to take from culture. And at this point, I'm actually defining culture. I'm becoming an architect of the culture from this point forward. I'm no longer just consuming culture. I'm now authoring culture. And I move from being an addictive role, kind of that reciprocal narrowing of contracting around some core sense of ego, to reciprocal opening and letting go of that core sense of ego.
One of the things that was coming up for me is talking about the teal swan thing is her being, one of the things that I had to come to a realization on was denial is something that exists for a reason. It is an important psychological mechanism that prevents the system from being thrown into trauma. And if you yank someone out of denial faster, when they're unprepared for it, the amount of trauma it can create. And so there's this idea of, maybe somebody needs to stay in their cell until they're ready to come out, and that, but how do we as a culture encourage the language and the discussion of understanding that we are in a prison without forcing someone out of denial before they're emotionally prepared for it? Because I think that's where most wars come from, is trying to force, is somebody being forced out of their denial before they're emotionally prepared for it. And so how do we encourage that without forcing it?
This is such a good question and so relevant. I wanted to go back because it is this, something I wrote down about your last question is related to this as well. I think about the mechanics of conversation a lot, and what are the things, the minimal kind of skills or tools that we need to be able to interface and debate, disagree, and then come to a new sense making and agree with each other. And a lot of it, what I'm noticing and paying attention to this, comes down to a willingness to push through and be in discomfort, and to work through that dissonance. So just to sit there like you're doing. I know you probably don't perceive us as like disagreeing with you. Maybe you perceive the guy in the chat as disagreeing, but for the sake of the conversation, I can just take that position. But you're pushing through that discomfort, or at least sitting with it and not opting out, which relates to the next thing, which is like, at what level do we step out of the box and engage in an environment, in an arena that is not comfortable to us? And you brought up the question of how does culture influence that? How do we create a culture that is better at detecting that and creating kind of language and conversation around that? And I hesitate to say it, but to me it seems like an kind of an imbalance of the masculine and feminine. Like it's almost like the masculine goes pushes out of the nest, pushes out into the world, go out there and get exposure. And it's almost like the feminine protects. And it's not a perfect analogy, but it's like protect and nurture, that kind of thing. And what I'm seeing out there when I observe the way debates and conversations and just what's happening online and what's happening in the meaning crisis and culture is this, first of all, a lack of wisdom to recognize when we should step out of that comfort zone. And if you look at like universities, it's been completely the opposite. It's to put up more walls between the student and the outside world, and to create more shelter and more filtering controls, giving more filtering controls to the individual. And we already have a lot of that with the internet. Like we can block out feeds from pages or from people that we don't want to hear opposing opinions from. We already have our hands on controls of our internet world to an insane degree, to the point that we create our own echo chambers almost instinctively and automatically, and that reflects out there in the real world too. So my question is something I'm working through, is trying to figure out, what does a wisdom look like and what do the control mechanisms look like for young people to give themselves exposure? Because the way it's going now, it seems like we don't press outside of that comfort zone, and we've become more childish and more protected and more insulated from the world than we have, say, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And it's an opposite trend. We're not getting stronger. We're creating comforts and filter mechanisms and bubbles and boxes, and we're not coming out of them nearly as much as we used to. And now going back to answer your point about wars starting on that note, like people pushing too far, it's like cognitive behavioral therapy. You have to break the thing down that you are afraid of into small chunks and then deal with those things in individual chunks. So if it's that you're afraid of spiders, the first chunk would be to just be in a room with a spider. And then you would chunk it, you would gradually increase the exposure. But I think you're right. And the conflict seems to happen a lot when it's one group of people who do have a certain amount of exposure to one thing, trying to push another group of people out of that, into that exposure prematurely or too harshly. Like I find myself doing it. So I think there's some tension there that needs to be looked at. But generally, to kind of wrap this whole thing up, I think a big part of it is exposure, that society, in trying to make safe places and make comfort and make like equal opportunity for everyone, is actually over sheltering.
To add something to that, this is something I'm pretty sure that I brought up before in one of the previous watch parties, is that our capacity to deal with emotional difficulty has declined in recent years, because the normal embeddedness in a community that we had has significantly declined, and that's how we used to cope with a lot of things or just process emotions. And now we don't have that anymore. So I think people are just a lot more fragile. And then it's that reciprocal narrowing on a societal level that's happening. People are becoming more atomized, more separate from community, from support networks. And then they're becoming weaker emotionally. They're not able to process things. They get traumatized more easily. And then they're trying to create safer places and kind of build more artificial structures to protect themselves from being emotionally damaged, which only isolates them more. And then it creates a loop that creates more and more pathology with every generation.
Yeah, well said.
So it's like we need to think about how do we break out of that loop, but without having these external support networks. Like it's that agent arena relationship. So it's not just about people being weak and needing safe spaces, that's bad thing or a good thing. It's also why is this happening? Because there are no natural support structures, because there's no community. So how do we recreate that community? And this is an idea that's often discussed as regenerative cultures, where we're trying to regenerate the environment. So the natural environment, the culture, our cities, our families, just the environment, so that it produces better people, so that it produces better outcomes overall.
It's such an interesting thing that it's like the internet is something that is simultaneously making us weaker in some ways, and yet creating a system of where people can find like the community that they don't have, in, it's like, I don't have the community near me. I know one other person besides my husband who knows about John Vervaeke in my community. And yet here I am talking to people all over the world about that. And um there's yeah. So, I'm deeply appreciative of people like you guys who are making, creating community as best as we can, as, imperfect as it is, we're doing that. And yeah, I think that's cool.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's crucial
Yeah.
that we do this, and I also think that it's I want to kind of sweep back around to your comment and notice there is something of I would say in reading Kujam's comments in the thread, there is something that has for me a feeling. I don't know if it's in him, and that's I agree with Micah. Would prefer to be able to have that conversation directly, but there's a sense, there's an air of moral superiority, an air of I know something, and if you don't know it, you just need to listen to me or listen to what the wisdom that I have. And there's something of a not possible really to do that. And this is the role of the individual of knowing when is there. It's something that's interesting for me. For whatever reason, as a young person, I had the sense of, oh, if a minister was moralizing to me in a way that was not helpful for me, I knew to let it go. Don't take that on. That's not helpful for me. And I don't know what the flavor of difference was, but having that ability to distinguish the flavor of difference allows me to allow them to speak. I don't need to stop them from speaking, because if it doesn't apply, it doesn't apply. But it does allow that sense of curiosity in me. Okay, where is this? Where is there something maybe here that's useful? Where does it connect to what they see? In a sense, I think there's a kind of defensive flavor to that moral superiority as well. That sense of I'm holding tightly to my faith, to my belief, to my reasoning structures to protect me from disintegrating. And this motion that's happening in the internet does seem to be a developmental shift of the ego boundaries becoming differently permeable. It's a very interesting moment in time where we can create new tribal units where we can isolate ourselves. We definitely can do that to and that's the mimetic tribes that Peter in Canada talks about. The Peter Lemberg, right? So we can see the formation of that, and the formation of the temptation to go towards cultish beliefs of, oh yeah, this we'll put a barrier around us and not let the infidels in. And something of, okay, now hold on, wait a minute. How do we not feel the injunction to demand that other people paint their prison walls in a matching color scheme to my own prison walls. I think there's something really subtle. I mean, I want to say that in a way that is provocative, but also curious. Like, I think there is something about that, something about both extremists on the right wing and the left wing, the incels and the social justice warriors, both are thinking, in order for the world to be safe, we need to all have the same color scheme on our prison walls, rather than recognizing, we're outgrowing our prison, right? It's kind of trying to make the inside of the eggshell like, oh, we're running out of oxygen, we need to make it so that, and it's because something like the recognition is, oh, we're breaking out of that. We no longer can contain ourselves within this structure, which has been nourishing up to this point, which has been necessary up to this point. It just is now confining in a way that is no longer nourishing.
There's something that relates to that, and somebody in the chat says, don't let the community become a commune. Oh, that's Kujam. And then people are talking about, let's see. Yeah, I'm guessing this is kind of like, don't let the community become a commune and don't let the commune become a cult. And I think that the problem here is that people want to belong at the level of ideas. They want to belong at the propositional level. And this relates actually to the end of the lecture, where he talks about how the this participatory knowing of the axial revolution became replaced by a favoring of a propositional knowing, where people had to have the right beliefs or had to have coherent thinking about ideas, and that was sufficient to, as a way of knowing something. So I think when people want to belong at the level of ideas, they try to seek others out who believe in the same ideas, and thereby creating echo chambers and cults. But in a healthy community, people belong on a participatory level. They don't necessarily believe in the same things. They don't necessarily hold the same ideas. They just participate with each other in a reciprocal way, just as humans. I don't know if I'm explaining that second part well, because I think it's become so lost that people, even me, like I'm struggling to explain this. Like, how do you just participate with somebody in a healthy and fulfilling way without necessarily holding the same beliefs?
It's like we're prioritizing the kind of cohesion in ideas instead of the tools that allow for cohesion when the ideas don't match. And the tools I'm saying are related to what I brought up before, but how do we converse? How do we debate? How do we actually seek truth, not to bolster our own identified position? So it's like, I think what you're talking about as a healthy community is one that has the tools of interface, healthy interface with each other, and could just be a group based on proximity, a town, village, whatever, but so a variation of opinions about any number of ideas, but the right set of tools, or at least a functional set of tools to be able to interface. And that's what I'm seeing we totally do not have. Out there in the world, we don't have the interface tools, and instead of developing those tools, we're finding meme tribes that just fit our same set of ideologies.
I was reminded of Yuvi when you were talking. He brought John was talking about those three things needed, and I forget. I don't have a good memory, so I don't. But he's talked about coherence, purpose, and something else being what you needed to have meaning, and so that and so right now, because and significance, and so not having the tools to be in the participatory with other people, we're looking for those we're looking for the community where there's ideas. And it actually makes sense to me that it's like, I can come here and participate with you guys and get a nourishing of, okay, there is a group of people who understand what I'm thinking, and I feel safe in a dialogue with them. And then I can go out and have that conversation, have the difficult conversations with people out in, the world, in in close proximity to me, because I know that there are at least some people in the world who understand where I'm coming from. And that's, I mean, thank goodness, because, if I didn't have places that I could go to get a sense, get nourished and feel like, okay, there's some people who get me, who understand like the things I'm thinking about. And because I think about really weird things and I talk about them in the real world, and people look at me like I've got two heads. And so, having that place to come gives me the courage to go out there. It's like, that's the purpose that moms serve. Is mom is home base from which I can go out and venture and try something new, and then go back and go, okay, I still have a safe place where I can go, and I'm accepted for who I am. And so, and Mike, going back to something that you said about, you said the word friction, and it was in a larger context. And one of the things that's been coming up in the conversation in Game B, and the thing I keep talking about, is I think what we're going to see eventually is that there is some ratio that groups form around that is friction or tension, or I think you would use the word tension, not friction, but there's some ratio of friction/tension to conflict resolution. And if you don't have enough tension, then the group just kind of stagnates and doesn't go, like it just kind of doesn't do anything. If there's too much tension and not enough conflict, the group, blows up, because they can't, it can't exist outside of, it can't sustain itself. And so, like, I think groups are forming that have that tension. And then, David, to your point of, I love that analogy of the egg of, people might not yet see, oh wait, I'm growing beyond this egg, I need to break out of this. I'm going to still hold on. I want to hold on tight and keep this thing around me. And, and I think, like, for me, it's that, and I go back to, I think something I mentioned last week, it's like, everything's perfect exactly the way it is, and it can't stay that way. Like a trust that things are unfolding exactly at the pace and speed that they're supposed to. And like, that helps me get comfortable with the, oh my God, we have to do something. We have to make this happen faster. And it's like, no, things are unfolding exactly the way they're supposed to. I don't know. That's a bunch of thoughts all tied together.
The thing about finding this community and feeling like you don't have that in wherever you are is something we hear a lot of, because what we're doing with Future Thinkers is so much about being a community where like-minded people can come in. But I'm catching myself using the wrong words lately, and you clarified something for me just now. The wrong word I'm meaning is like-minded. It's not that we're like-minded. It's that the thing I brought up before about the willingness and having the tools to discuss is actually highly developed in the people in the core group, and people are coming into it and gaining those tools as well. So coherence goes up. But we're actually coming from, like, in our group calls, we're from all over the globe, and we have totally different cultural, societal, economic, everything, every background. All our contexts are totally different, but we do have that set of conversational tools from things like circling and just ego deconstruction and desire and to seek truth, not to bolster my own perspective. Like, those sort of core tenets of conversation are present, which makes it seem like we're all like-minded, because we're all just listening to each other, a novel thing. but it's not. And I think that's an important thing to articulate, because it again highlights the problem out there in the world. It's not necessarily that we're all different and we can't find our tribes. It's that we're not listening to each other very well, and we're not actually like using the conversational technology to find common ground. And one thing I find, and I'll just wrap this up quickly, is that you had mentioned about the kind of a necessary amount of tension. You talked about game B. I don't know that it's the tension. I think it's the effort that people are willing to expend depending on the size of groups that they're in. How worth it is it for me to expend this effort to mediate or come to a resolution with this person I disagree with, or these two people that are colliding with each other, and bring it to some fruitful resolution, or versus banning them because the group's too big and it's too much effort, and these conversations are happening too frequently that I'd rather just get rid of people who are not able to use conversational tools effectively. So it's like I find that weighting too, because I get into serious conversations with just polar opposite ideological, religious, anything kind of perspectives, and we're able to find common ground quite often, like regularly. And it's because both parties are willing to push through that discomfort. But when there's too many people, it's like, fuck that. I'm not wasting that energy. So I can see why Dunbar's number and all that stuff, just from practical lived experience, becomes a really important thing. And I don't know how to scale that. Like, how do you scale game B? Don't know.
There's I think that there's a couple of things that come up. One is how to sort of how to cultivate wisdom in a crowd sense versus foolishness in a crowd sense. And I think that in a textual format, the notion of moving towards propositional, which has to be agreement and like-mindedness, is more likely, which creates a kind of a foolish adherence to norms. I don't think it allows for as much complexification that happens within the individuals, what the additive pieces are. It is kind of, in a way, locking us into, I'm going to oversimplify, but into a left brain mode of thinking, of really trying to, it locks us into the propositional. And without agreement at the propositional, we lose that common ground. But the way that, so it seems like circling is one way to start to scale it, but it's a little bit of a challenge there as well. This is more than, it's a real interesting dynamic tension that's happening, and I think that we will discover that we're growing a capacity for a group to be dynamically wise at different scales. And the tension that I imagine when I hear you talk about tension, Kira, is like surface tension. It's the coherence part of it. It is the thing that's holding it together. The friction is the thing that would blow it apart, and the purpose is the reason why I'm here. So there's something of those three things that John mentions: the significance, coherence, and purpose that are interacting in the dynamics of a group. And if it is something like Jordan Hall's notion of sovereignty is expressed in that ability of a group to be able to have that sense without a roundness of those three aspects, right? Similar to agency. You guys always know the three parts of sovereignty better than me. Agency,
perception,
sense-making, and agency.
Yeah, agency, perception, and sense-making. Those are analogous to the significance, coherence, and purpose. They may even be mapped more directly. I don't know, but there's something of that I think makes sense. I may be oversimplifying about this as well. So I don't want to too tightly confine the model. To try to map the territory too tightly to a model. But there is something of the notion, to go back again to the notion of the addictive thing, and that we are born into kind of a prison-minded set of ideas. There's a dependence that is difficult to, it's more challenging for us to develop that independence over time and that interdependence eventually. You know, Kujam's comment in there as well is, we don't want to get too much into a commune mindset, which is a lockdownness, right? This is the conformity of thought within that, the group think that prevents individuals from thinking that way. And Mike, as you mentioned, universities and tribal affiliations are doing that more and more. And it's something like, and I love what you said, Kira, about the mother's purpose is to raise the child such that it can survive in the world and has some place safe to come back to process and integrate and metabolize the challenges that it's had. But if the home and the mother becomes about reifying the mother's perspective and subverting the child's perspective, the child becomes to feed the mother, then that's
the devouring mother archetype.
Yeah,
exactly. And so we're at a point now in our culture where we can see that that's where we have that devouring mother type archetype within the culture, within this frame that's there. And I think that there's something like that is, my guess is that this is the trigger that shifts us from game A mentality, consumptive, in the caterpillar mode or the larval stage, to game B, expansive. There's a whole new world possible outside of the egg or outside of the pond scum that I've known the full inside of, right? I know the full inside of this, but thinking that's the whole universe until I'm starved of actual new insight. And then I burst forth into another world. I burst out of the egg, I burst out of the pond scum, I grow wings and fly above it. It's like, oh, the world is much bigger than I thought it was. I am now newly able to explore in a way that I didn't have before. And I think we're there at that point, and trying to solve it from inside the egg or from inside the pond scum is obviously foolish. We have no idea what's on the other side of it.
I really do like that analogy, David. And what came up for me is kind of linking this back to what we were starting at the beginning, which was, if I see someone else in another egg and me thinking, well, clearly you've reached the edge of your egg and you need to break out of it. And and here I am, I'm going to crack your egg open and, and force you to look at the rest of the world, assuming that that I know that this other person is ready to be pulled out, yanked out of their egg. And I think these communities where it's like, okay, we're being able to like go from this community, I spent quite a bit of time in the Jordan Peterson community, and like there was some stuff I needed to learn there, and I spent some time in that pond scum. and I still do at times, and realizing like, and there are people that I know that I care about that are still in that one, and they still have things that they're learning, and I'm like, come on, I want you to hurry up and eat all the things in there so that I can bring you into this other pond scum. And like, but it's like seeing the other people and thinking that, well, because I have outgrown my egg, clearly you must have outgrown your egg, that you've outgrown your egg too. And, that forcing someone out of their egg and trusting that somebody's right where they need to be. And I'm going to communicate with them at the level that they're at as best as I can. Sometimes I'm more graceful at that than others. But I do like that analogy because, it's, if I look at somebody, I'm like, you see it all the time on Twitter of, and I don't go on Twitter very much anymore for this reason, which is like, I've literally seen people say, how could you possibly come to any other conclusion? And it's like, because they have a different set of life experiences, and some people just don't understand that. And it's like, okay, I'm going to let you do your thing over in that egg pond scum, whatever it is that's over there, and I'm going to be over here in my egg pond scum over here, and eventually maybe we'll meet and be able to have more of a conversation. And I'm not going to try and force you out of your position.
Yeah, there's an interesting notion that if I look at that, but exactly that, if I'm in my bubble and I look at you in your bubble, and we have enough communication that I can see that you're in a different bubble, I can say something like, if I say something like, oh, you're unclean or unworthy or not smart enough or not worthy, too weak or something, yeah, then that's a judgment that you should be the same as me. You should orient to your environment the same way that I orient to my environment. But if I say, oh, you're unripe, oh, there's still some maturation to grow. I have no idea what your ripeness, what would move you in the direction of your ripeness. It can also possibly have a similar pejorative type notion, but it's like, I don't know. It's to me, it seems more accurate to somehow recognize that we're developing separately, and that I can't project, I can't trust my projection that you should orient to your environment the same way that I should orient to mine. And I think the bigger aspect of this that is important to recognize is we're in a place now where we can see inside of each other's bubbles more clearly. This is something that just recently, the article that came out that somebody was saying, oh, I didn't know that some people don't think with a verbal narrator in their head. They think conceptually. And that article went viral in a way that was, oh, we can sort of see that people are processing information and orienting differently. And it's kind of a shock, right? It's kind of oh, that's normal that people think differently. There's something of an orientation in the larval stage that has us orient as if we're all the same. And in that assumption that we're the same, there's sort of a proof by contradiction. Develop. No, I'm different. And I'm different because I know that I'm not you. And it's like, but we're supposed to be the same. So if I must be right and you must be wrong, if we're supposed to be the same, it can't be. And it's like, at some point we recognize, oh no, the difference actually is the gift. The distinction between the way that you see the world and the way that I see the world is the way that we see something that neither of us could. That gives us the potential for a new form of parallax, a new way of saying, there's something bigger here that neither of us could see. Actually, and I want to point this out, Lynn, you've been really quiet, and it brings to mind real quick, because I know that you have a visual challenge, that the notion of the blind man and the elephant comes to mind a lot. That sense of, how do we recognize that we're seeing something larger than any one of us has the part of? So I don't want to frame it that you have to respond from that perspective, but it does just come to mind, and that was some. But you have been on my mind for a while. That I wonder if there's an opportunity or a desire for you to jump in here.
Well, it's working, right? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If I have spinach on my face, please tell me. This is what I value the most. So, with the elephant, I think when it comes to color, I value the color purple because with my eye disease, retinitis pigmentosa, I have, like a normal person has 120 degrees of peripheral vision. I have 15 degrees of peripheral vision. So as my peripheral vision, as I lose sight and go blind, the first color that I'm going to lose sight to see is the color purple. So just because you all see the elephant as gray and I see the elephant as white, it doesn't matter. It's still an elephant. But that's the only thing that's the only thing that comes to mind with that. And on another note about music, Mr. John mentioned the word stupefy. Stupefied? He used the term stupefied for 3 lectures. He didn't use that term today. So for the last 3 lectures, I've had this heavy metal band Disturbed in my head whenever he says stupefied. So anyway, that's it.
Thanks. That's cool. I like that we're tracking the notes that John is using in the lectures, and it's something that I continue to recognize as well. There's a thematic connection. Like I'm not at all surprised that addiction comes up as a major theme today. It's been the thing that I've been contemplating over the past week. This sense of the reciprocal narrowing has to do with the addictive short range immediate gratification, and reciprocal opening has to do with the more long range compound interest kind of if I can stick with that, delay gratification and mine it over time, there's a reciprocal opening. And it's very interesting because I glance over at the comments in the YouTube thread every once in a while. And I have to say that Kujam again said something that was like it was a propositionally, for me, a provocative statement of matriarchal societies are always chaotic and collapsing, and patriarchal is the only thing that moves forward. And it's like, that's a real interesting perspective. And I think that historically, there may be, on average, some validity to that perspective. And I think we're at a point where the validity of that is collapsing, that there is no more room to move in the patriarchal, penetrative, extractive model, that we have to allow the chaos and collapse and falling apart to regrow, the falling apart being the protection of the eggshell, right? Yeah, to destroy the eggshell before now would have been death. To keep the eggshell beyond now will mean death. So it doesn't mean that the eggshell is good or bad. It's really recognizing where is it useful and where is it not. And there's something that's interesting in there's something that's interesting because I think that the perception of that protective barrier, that membrane, has been propositionally misunderstood given the cultural eggshell in which humanity is operated. And as the cultural eggshell, the cultural membrane, civilizational membrane that we have is shifting, it's potentially shifting it for us individually as well. So there's something that's shifting for us in a way that means there is an individual and a process of true individuation into maturity that has a more collective weave between us, right? Not because of our similarity, not because of our like-mindedness, but because of our contrasting complementary natures, right?
There's a point from Lynn that relates to what you were just saying now, David, about the patriarchal society coming up to its limits now and maybe needing to change. And there's something about the elephant thing that Lynn had said. So I'm going to show that our favorite little diagram here you're all familiar with. This is true. This is true. This is truth. Now, I love looking at this and thinking about this, and this is an expansion on that where there's a third dimension here. I love thinking about this because it abstracts up a layer when we're talking about ideas. We're talking about the elephant. Like the elephant is already three-dimensional and we're touching a three-dimensional object. So there's some higher dimension beyond that we're really describing when we're describing our different perspectives on it. It's like the elephant, It's like an idea of what an elephant is. And it's actually a really interesting thing when we think about artificial intelligence, why it's so hard to recognize an object as an object, because there's so many different angles or variations that you can look at it from. And it's very difficult for an AI to know that a purple polka dotted elephant is still an elephant, or an elephant with no legs is still an elephant, or an elephant with no legs, no trunk, no ears is still an elephant. Like, that's impossible to recognize, but we as humans can look at that and be like, yeah, that's an elephant. It's just kind of fucked up. But now this relates to the...
Just to say, you stopped broadcasting, so I noticed that the first screen, when you share a diagram, it doesn't.
Oh yeah, sorry guys in the in the chat. I forgot about that. That you guys don't see it, but I'll post the link to that. Now I have to find the stop screen share button. Where the hell is the stop screen? Oh, that's not good. Where's the stop screen share button?
Yeah, I think it does. I think it's a bug in Zoom that it does something that it now has. Oh, there we are. We're back. Let's see if we catch up on the screen share. Yeah,
okay,
cool.
So chat. Here you go. Here's what I was talking about. Sorry, big long link. Too long of a link. Damn it. Now I gotta hold my train of thought too here. Okay, I can't paste the link, so just search perspective, triangle, square, cylinder in Google image. Sorry. So now this relates to the not having enough room to move in the kind of patriarchal society. Now I look at society and I think there's a shadow expression of the patriarchy or the masculine, and there's a shadow expression of the feminine. And probably based on my perspective, I'm witnessing a lot more shadow in the feminine, and probably, well, in conversations with Yuvi brings up witnessing the shadow of the masculine a lot too. So it's, the perspective is bleeding into my perception here, obviously. But what I'm seeing is it's more of a dimensional issue. We're looking at the material dimension and we're seeing the limits of where the masculine can go. But we look out on the internet and this kind of other dimension of expression, and there's all of a sudden a need for the masculine, this like make ground, make new things, push forward kind of thing. And plus, in the material world, in the relational world, there is still the problem of how do we deal with the shadow of both those things. And you don't deal with the shadow of masculine by wiping out masculine or overcompensating with more feminine. You have to actually like make mature masculinity out there. And that's something that's not really being addressed. It's like there's a pendulum swing between the two dichotomies, and we're trying to swing it towards the feminine instead of being like, hey, masculine, you need to get mature. You know what I mean? It's not appropriate to swing too far either way. That's it.
So I do have to hop off here in just a minute, but there's a bunch of different thoughts that are all kind of coming together. It's, in one of the communities that I hang out in, they talk about balance being that place that I swing by really fast as I swing from one end to the other. And I think of, a swing that it's gonna swing, keep swinging backwards and forwards until it comes to that equilibrium in the middle. And so, the swinging from one direction to another isn't necessarily a bad thing, although, the goal is to get towards the center. But it's like, okay, did we swing as far the other direction this time, or did we swing a little bit less? I think that's such an interesting piece. And earlier on in the conversation, we were talking about how we were more resilient. I think that 20, 30 years ago, we were more resilient. And I want to
push back
on that one a little bit, because 20, 30 years ago, the number of ideas that we were each individually exposed to was so much smaller that it might have seemed like we were more resilient, but there was so much more hegemony of thought within the small group of people that we were talking to, that you didn't talk about the fact that, hey, my neighbor is a flat earther, you know, like that just didn't exist. And so that idea that we've lost resilience, I think, is actually a misnomer. I think it's more that our capacity for resilience is increasing, that the amount of resilience that is needed is being asked. And so it's more of like, the amount of resilience that's needed is being upgraded, not that we've gone backwards.
Actually, I see it as both. I see it that we've gone backwards and it's being asked, more is being asked of us. And I see that they're being, like, we have to rise to an occasion to meet with the increased demands. But in a lot of ways, I think we're going the wrong way, if that's what we're going to try and do, to create more filters, more shelter, more safe spaces, that sort of thing. I'm not saying that's it seems like that whole idea, that kind of meme is collapsing out there right now. And people are realizing that's not working, and we can't just kind of isolate and create safe spaces. So I think that's collapsing as it is. So for me to make a comment on where we're going, I'm just saying that is a step backwards, whatever that idea is, whether it's applying in society or not. That's a step backwards. We do need to expose ourselves. But your point is, I agree with as well. The demands are insane, and the whole system is just, it's not working for us, and it's requiring so much more out of us.
And then the one other thing I wanted to say was, David, going back to your what you were saying about, the expectation that the other minds are exactly like ours. I read an article recently that talked about the metaphor of the mind of the mind as a machine is no longer effective, because the way we think of a machine has input and it has output. So the idea is, if you guys are each separate machines, if you hear the same input that I do, you're going to have the same output. Whereas if we switch the mind as an ecosystem that has might have one type of weather system that, depending on, it might have a microclimate in one area, and this other mind has a different microclimate, and how it's going to each respond to a different. The person went into much more detail, and I can find the article and put a link to it in the chat, because I thought it was a really important and valuable way of looking at the differences in our minds. And I love John's thing about our cultural grammar, and I think also our cultural metaphors for, the base metaphors of how we think about the mind play such a huge role in how we perceive other people. And if I think of the mind as a machine, I'm going to expect you to come to the same input as I do. And I think that's a developmental stage that we're all going through. I think we all sort of expect that, well, if you hear, this politician say this thing, clearly you should come to the same conclusion that I've come to, that's what that means. And when in reality, my life experience might cause me to come to a completely different conclusion. But we haven't upgraded that mind as a machine metaphor to something more complicated. And as our metaphors grow in their sophistication, I think that's going to change how people are able to think about other people as part of that.
I know you've got to go. There's just one thing I'd like to drop in here, because it's really another important thing that's been highlighted for me. So you brought up the whole thing about we have our perspectives, and society needs to recognize that we do have different perspectives on the same thing. We don't have that automatic singular definition of things. And there's something about that relates to what I know about programming, where it's like two different applications have two different libraries of words that they use with definitions of those words. And now, if you want those two different programs to interface with each other, they need to actually update each other's library so that all the definitions are the same, or they just use the same library. And there's something that it relates to the whole thing about deconstructing identity that we brought up earlier, where when we're too kind of stuck onto our own perspectives, as if that's the most valuable thing, when we identify with our libraries, then we don't actually end up doing anything to update that library to be compatible with anyone else's. So there's something about like disidentify and update your library so that you can interface better with others. That the perspective is not so valuable. It is differentiating us, and it is there, and it is valid, but there's a necessary application programming interface that we need to have, and we can't do that if we're stuck to our library. And in other words, stuck to that, what these words mean to, and it brings up the whole thing at the beginning of the conversation of what weak means to you versus what weak means to me. We're having a library conflict in how we're interfacing with each other. And it's important that you don't have to discard your whole library, but we both need to update each other's library. So it's like, I need to know that saying weak has a different primary definition for you. And you need to know that it has a different primary definition for me. And if we can just suspend our own definition and use each other's, then we can proceed. We've created that interface between each other. But if we are, and it relates to that thing of like, we need to figure out the right way to speak to each other so that we don't trigger that in each other. That's impossible. It's like we need to be willing to update our own libraries and other people's libraries. And if someone else can't update their library, we have to update our own if we're going to progress. You know, we can't expect that both parties will do it. I have to be like, you know what, I shouldn't use the word weak because it doesn't work. In not assuming, because you've obviously demonstrated your willingness to update the library. So, but I mean, if you demonstrated that you couldn't, then I need to stop using that word.
I love that. I really do. And I think there are so many people who are not willing to do that. They're not willing to update their library because somebody else can't.
And by the way, I don't mean it altogether. I mean, I don't need to stop using that word altogether. I have to have the wisdom to recognize that you're not updating your library, which is a problem. But I don't have to force you to update yours or belittle you because you're not updating it. I just have to, in this context, update mine. Yeah. And then discard it later.
There's another thing that is important to mention here, and Mike and I, we had this conversation a couple of days ago, that it's not just the library, it's also the operating system. That different people just have different operating systems. And that's what you're raised with, that's, you know, what your life experiences are, and maybe your first language is kind of your first layer of your programming, and you can interface with other people by updating libraries, but there's still going to be some differences. Like, and I think it's important to recognize that people just have a different operating system, and you might not come to a perfectly the same definition of things or perfectly the same understanding of what something means or an experience.
If we're going to stick with that, if we're going to stick with that analogy, I think operating system actually kind of complicates it. It's like we're running different applications because operating system assumes that we can't deconstruct that. It's the same thing I'm talking about where these libraries we become identified with. If your perception, if your childhood, if your way of looking at the world is integral to your if you say it's an operating level, system level thing, then it's not something I could ever work to change. If it's an application I'm running, it's something I can change. It may be a deeply embedded application, but just that subtle variation on those two things I think is important because I've never encountered anything about myself I can't deconstruct. So by calling it an operating system, I'm running that. I can't do anything about that.
So it is interesting because I think this is,
Bye.
See you later, Kira.
It's been great. I'll see you guys
thanks
next
for
week.
coming. It's
Right,
awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I do think this is kind of an interesting point of the distinction between self as machine versus self as ecosystem. Because I think that what evolution does afford is the possibility of rewriting our operating system.
Right.
Truly operating system, not just application. And that's a very powerful distinction. And I think it is difficult to grasp, and that's one of the reasons game B is so difficult to actually conceptualize and talk about, is because evolving a new operating system is so beyond our propositional that it breaks our ability to agree at the propositional layer.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I can see that. It almost makes
also,
my point about the application moot. If the operating system is upgradable, then it's like, sure, let's, yeah.
It also is interesting to think about a couple of the authors that I think about recently. Donald Hoffman, the case against reality, that reality isn't, that the operating system is what we assume is reality. But when you really get down to it and you test it, you can find the limits of that. And that's the point at which you actually have the ability to update the operating system, right?
It's
the user interface. That's right.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the in McGilchrist, and the master and his emissary, and thinking about right brain versus left brain. The left brain tends to see things as a mechanical, and the right brain tends to see things as ecosystems. But as Ian McGilchrist would also say, that is a left brain characterization of left and right brain. Yeah, we don't know what a right brain characterization of left and right brain really is. We have a very flimsy metaphor for it, but the whole thing operating in the background at the substrate down at the participatory level is so way beyond our flimsy little user interface conception of, oh, that little blue thing is a file.
So you're saying we all need to get down to command line. Discard with the operating systems.
Be careful when you're partitioning that hard drive.
Yeah. Yeah. You can really fuck stuff up there. One command, one word.
Yeah.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
This has been fun.
Yeah, thank you. It's been good.
Awesome. See ya
Next week.
Thursday. We doing something on Tuesday, UV?
No, not this week.
Okay, Thursday it is.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
And for everybody else, next Monday.
All right.
See y'all later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank
Thank you.
you.